Siaga seprasniarana, soga secasniarana, Tatya psaran, pranat pesarana, Sias negat ofres hotzmodna. Bachwef, Kalang, Xahmani Tyryana, Tamar Tyryani Ahsinadne. When ye sechana the prastef kalfamamnaria. Bachwef, Mananahi. Taliasas netazi, Batsne Tyryani na Marisami Swanis, Pranatas Niaradna Mine Nyasne. Rekanami Mahasni Alexni. Mekimanyar Hyahuzet, Tomar Tyryana Zanziris. Ast, Pserani zet, Sanyame Fazel. Tomar Tyryani, Tomar Teme. Lanyech Maila Petum, Sanyech Onya Shirana. But really, the creator of Tyryani is not Xahmani but me, a conlanger, who started work on Tyryani in the winter of 2019. Originally, it was meant only to be a sketch language, serving as the proto-lang for another conlang of mine, but I liked it too much. I created a proto-proto-lang, and Tyryani became itself a full conlang, probably my most developed one so far. Tyryani is a member of the vast and diverse Naro-Danjatic language family. Dolini, a Dorian language, is the second most developed of these languages, and most of the rest are just sketches. As I mentioned before, Chani was my first real conlang that I feel okay even calling a conlang. And I plan to revamp it at one point once I'm satisfied with the other languages I'm working on. Hopefully Dolini gets its own conlang showcase soon too. So before I go into the actual showcase here, I just want to thank the people who helped me edit and look over the showcase, and so here are their names in Tyryani script. Also, I will take this opportunity to ask everyone to like, comment, subscribe, etc. Just so this channel can be nothing. So on to the showcase. So Tyryani started out being spoken by the Tyryani people around the Lake Tyr, one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. But because of the Tyrian Empire, it spread everywhere, and its descendants litter the landscape today. In its growth, it sent most of its close relatives to extinction, which makes it hard to exactly reconstruct what its proto-lang might have looked like. Tyryani has gone through many sound changes, reducing the number of distinct phonemes, and yet making more complex the phonotactics of the language. So, Proto-Tyrian had 20 distinct consonants and 10 distinct vowels, but in the sound changes leading to Tyryani, some aspirated stops became fricatives, unstressed short vowels dropped a lot, and the resulting clusters simplified. The long vowels, with the exception of A, which became A, developed into iotated vowels, which palatalized the consonant before them. The short vowels merged in various ways depending on stress, which created interesting vowel shifts when conjugating. Overall, Tyryani has 17 consonants and 5 vowels. The exact pronunciations of these sounds, however, varies by dialect. For example, in the north, the uvular A can be pronounced as the glottal stop A, whereas in the south it's more likely to be the voiced velar Ga. In this video, we'll primarily be focusing on Tyryani Rekan, the dialect spoken near the Jia Desert. So Proto-Tyrian only allowed resonance and plain fricatives to serve as syllable codas. But Tyryani is more complicated. But looking at this ugly mess won't actually help you get an idea of the syllable structure. It's better to think about it in terms of permitted clusters. These are the only clusters that can exist in Tyryani. They can come at any place in the word instead of a normal consonant, initially, medially, and finally. But there's another issue, palatalization or iotation. Whatever you want to call it, basically, after consonants and clusters, there may exist a palatal approximate ya. Some analyze this as a contrastive feature of the vowels, citing as how most vowels change in quality when iotated. Others analyze it as a contrastive feature of the consonants, citing how certain consonants can't be palatalized, and other consonants are pronounced differently when palatalized. And still others analyze it as just another consonant in a cluster. With regards to Tyryani's past, the vowelists are right. The ya did evolve from separate vowels most of the time. With regards to its future, the consonantists are right. The ya will merge with the consonants before it and create new consonant phonemes. For now though, we'll take the third approach and analyze it as a clustered consonant, in order to stay neutral and not double the number of distinct phonemes in either category. Tyryani stress is predictable under 6 rules. Stress never follows before the antepenultimate. Certain suffixes demand stress on certain syllables, you just have to know the suffix to know the stress. The last en in a word is stressed. Stress is penultimate if the penultimate is closed or iotated, and stress is ultimate if the ultimate is closed. Otherwise, stress is on the leftmost possible syllable. Also, Tyryani is stress timed rather than syllable timed, which means that the period of time between moments of high stress tends to be constant, rather than the period of time between syllables being constant. A lot of vowel reduction occurs in unstressed syllables, especially in quick speech. Tyryani is a slightly fusional head marking language with differential object marking, a large case system, an animacy-based role marking system, converbs, and no grammatical agreement whatsoever. Also, Tyryani only has two major lexical classes. Nouns and verbs take separate morphology and are thus distinct, but almost all adjectives and adverbs are actually derived explicitly from nouns or verbs. They aren't themselves separate classes. Only a tiny fraction of adjectives and adverbs aren't derived from nouns or verbs. For nouns, Tyryani distinguishes 10 cases, 4 numbers, and definiteness. Definiteness, though, is only distinguished in the nominative singular of certain nouns, which take a final consonant to indicate their definiteness. Nouns are organized into declensions based on their final or lack of one. Actually, the declensions correspond to only those consonants that could function as codas in the Proto-Lang, even when 4 of those can exist word finally in the modern language. For example, the noun pese, meaning letter, is of the ng declension, which means that its proto-final was the velar nasal ng, but velar ng became alveolar n after front vowels word finally, and so the definite form of pese is not peseng, but pesen. Another thing to note is that finals contradict the stress rules. They don't influence stress at all. Tyryani cases are split into suffix cases, prefix cases, and circumfix cases. The nominative, dative, comitative, and instrumental cases are suffix cases. The accusative and evidential cases are prefix cases, and the locative cases, adessive, inessive, lative, and ablative, are circumfix cases. So you might be wondering, are the locative cases really circumfix cases because they don't seem to have a prefix there, just suffixes? Well, they do have a type of prefix which really manifests as palatalization of the first consonant of the root, and this comes directly from the Proto-Lang, which only had prefix cases, and E was the prefix for the locative case. But this palatalization is sometimes even dropped from common speech in Tyryani, and only the suffixes are used. The Tyryani cases have many functions. The locative cases are used for spatial reference, but also temporal reference, Nyanasami, Sieranami, and things like transformation, as well as comparatives and superlatives. The evidential case is used to express the source of information, think according to. The comitative case is used not only for accompaniment, but also for conjunction between noun phrases. And the dative case, well, the dative case is perhaps the most annoying and yet most fascinating case in Tyryani. It is used for recipients, beneficients, goals, instigators, reasons, and to increase saliency. It is also used colloquially as a genitive, and is the main way of forming adjectives out of nouns. It is used so much that its original functions are eroding. The lative case is colloquially replacing the dative in recipient situations, and the ablative is replacing it in the benefactive sense. The accusative isn't used in every transitive sentence. It's only used on the direct object when you want to make the verb intensive. Many verbs have two meanings, one when the direct object is in the nominative case, or unmarked, and one when it's in the accusative case. For example, the difference between see and watch isn't expressed through use of two different verbs, but through the marking of the direct object in the accusative case for watch and the nominative case for see. Same thing with the distinction between eat and devour. The one exception is in high register dialects where they don't have this distinction. They always use the accusative for direct objects, and therefore their vocabulary of verbs is bigger to make up for it, containing many words most speakers would find archaic or unnecessary, like luxaza here. Tyryani verbs take 2 voices and 10 forms. Main clause verbs must take the imperfective, perfective, or present form, and the other 7 forms are reserved for converbs. Converbs are basically what we represent with adverbs in English, to subordinate causes, while doing something, before doing something, in order to do something, etc. Converb endings were formed when the case suffixes got affixed to verbs, and so the endings will look somewhat similar. Ciljasa. The present and perfective active and passive forms, in addition to one other special form, are also used to make adjectives from verbs. Juanzilla. All other meaning for main clause verbs is conveyed through use of auxiliary particles. You may have noticed these in many of the sample sentences so far. There are 10 main particles, each conveying a different tense aspect mood combination of meaning. The particles work independently from the verb conjugation, except that future particles can't be combined with perfective verb forms. 4 of the particles carry meanings that are notoriously hard for foreigners to grasp. The complex realis particles have to do with both the present and the past. The perfect particle indicates that an action has been completed and the results of it have not been reversed. The action's results are still there. You can think about it as having a positive value in both the present and the past. The negative past particle indicates that an action has not been completed yet. You can think about this one as having a negative value in both the present and the past. The nominative indicates that an action had never been done before, but is being done now. It's similar to, but not exactly the same as, an inchoative particle, which would indicate that an action is just starting. But the nominative particle has that second implication, that it's never been done before, at least in a while. This particle has a negative value in the past, but a positive value in the present. And the discontinuous particle indicates that the action has been done, but its results have been reversed and are no longer relevant. So a positive value in the past, but a negative value in the present. A main clause verb with no particles is a present progressive or habitual, and traditionally at least, the present form of the verb must be used in the absence of particles. However, colloquially, it is possible to drop particles and yet still use the imperfective form of the verb, and this gives you a present progressive meaning. In Tyryani, negation is marked on verbs by placing the particle hu before the optional auxiliary particle. However, negative imperatives use the particle trajo instead, and place it always at the beginning of the sentence. Tyryani is a double negating language. In other words, two words with negative meaning don't cancel each other out, but instead reaffirm each other. Many dialects of English are double negating. They, as well as Tyryani, would say, I don't have no money, instead of I don't have any money. But many Tyryani sentences lack verbs entirely. Tyryani has a zero copula, which means there's no word for to be. The old man is the same as the man is old. Planteme. Verbs are not only absent for sentences like this, which equate to phrases, but also for other types, depending on the case of the predicate. For example, few people use a word for to go or to have in Tyryani. Instead, they use the lative or dative case on the predicate. We're all going to the hospital would be we all to hospital. And my father has a dog would be dog father of mine. Praya kamen, chapya pahyanatsa. Auxiliary particles indicating the tense aspect mood may still be used between the initial noun and the case mark predicate, even when there's no lexical verb. Also, there's the problem of how to use converbs on phrases that don't actually have verbs. How would you say, because we're all going to the hospital? Normally, you would just apply the converb ending because to the verb going, but going isn't actually a verb in this case. Instead, Tyryani has merged a relative marker with the converb endings to form what are known as relative converbs. Speakers put them at the beginning of the clause. The Tyryani word order, role marking, and voice systems are infamous in the world of Vachan. They all depend on the confluence of 3 variables: animacy, topicality, and thematic role. But first, 4 rules that apply always are that the verb always comes after the subject and object, more animate nouns always precede less animate nouns, auxiliary particles always come directly after the subject, and the topic is always the subject. Based on these rules and the 3 variables from before, there are 4 different types of transitive phrases that can exist in Tyryani. If the topic is both the agent and the most animate noun, word order is subject, object, verb, SOV, with both nouns unmarked. If the topic is the agent but the least animate noun, word order is OSV, with the object in the accusative case. If the topic is both the patient and the least animate noun, use the passive voice and put the agent in the dative case at the front of the sentence. And if the topic is the patient but the most animate noun, use the passive voice again and put the agent in the dative case but behind the verb. Those were the types of transitive phrases in Tyryani, but there are also 3 different types of intransitive phrase. In every intransitive phrase, the single noun is always marked with the nominative case, or unmarked, and it always comes before the verb. What distinguishes the 3 types is rather the voice of the verb and the optional inclusion of a reflexive pronoun. In active intransitive phrases, the sole noun is analyzed as the agent with an unspecified patient. It's important to understand that in the second sentence here, we're not saying the man walked, we're saying he walked something, as in he made something walk. In passive intransitive phrases, the sole noun is analyzed as the patient or as an avolitive experiencer, someone who experiences the action but doesn't really do it on purpose. In the first sentence, the man is the patient, and in the second sentence, he's an avolitive experiencer. In Tyryani, there isn't really a distinction between the two. In reflexive intransitive phrases, the reflexive pronoun re stands in for an object, and the active voice is used. The sole noun is analyzed as both the agent and the patient, or as a volitive experiencer or agent. Nouns are typically head initial in Tyryani, with adjectives, relative clauses, and genitives following the noun. However, most numerals and all demonstratives precede the noun. Notice that in the second sentence, the word order is exactly the opposite of English. Adverbial phrases are almost always post-clefted or pre-clefted, never between the subject, object, and verb. There are 3 types of relative phrases in Tyryani: nominal, adjectival, and adverbial. Nominal relative phrases stand in for noun phrases, and are formed simply by the inclusion of the relative particle le at the start of the phrase. Adverbial relative phrases are also simple. Converbs are used. Usually converbs appear without subjects, for the subject is assumed to be the topic of the main clause. However, if a different subject is needed, the relative particle le is used before the phrase. But adjectival relative phrases are where it gets hard. There are multiple strategies for these in Tyryani. The first strategy is to use converbs, but this strategy only works when the head is the subject of both clauses. The second strategy is to use verb-derived adjectives, but then one of the arguments of one of the clauses has to be omitted. For example, it's ungrammatical in that sentence to add the person who saw the animal. You have to choose one of the clauses and prioritize it, or split the phrases into 2 separate sentences. Long adjectival relative clause chaining does not exist in Tyryani. Many statives in Tyryani don't follow the normal clause structure. Instead, they begin with a noun as the state and end with a dative phrase as the experiencer. Modal constructions in Tyryani have a similar structure. There are 3 types: deontic, dynamic, and epistemic. Deontic modals have to do with a speaker's attitude towards or individual knowledge of an event, and they have 3 forms. First, a normal verb form just like any other, when you're scared of something. Se ne pasa, se ne man. Second, a dative phrase with a non-finite object, when the subject is the same in the inner and outer clauses, when you're scared that you do something. And here, the non-finite particle can combine with the initial noun. And the last form is similar, but instead with a relative clause object, when the subject is different between the inner and outer clauses, when you're scared that someone else is doing something. And again, the initial noun's confused with the relative particle ve. Baswe manasmanyatsedna. Manave manyasmanyatsedna. Dynamic modals, having to do with the speaker's capacity to perform an event, only have one form, a data phrase with a non-finite object. Epistemic modals, having to do with the likelihood of an event occurring, also only have one form, but theirs is a zero copula phrase with a relative object. In all of the examples with the data phrase at the end here, the auxiliary particles must come directly before the final dative marked noun, rather than as usual directly behind the subject, or initial noun. Tyryani pronouns feature 3 persons and 4 numbers. However, there are only 10 pronouns in total, due to the merger of second and third person paucal and collective pronouns. Tyryani has a formality distinction when it comes to second person and third person reference. In polite or humble contexts, the normal second and third person singular and plural forms aren't used. Instead, you would either use someone's official title or marker of relation to you, or just use the second and third person collective pronoun. A singular third person pronoun ne is only used anaphorically, or when referring back to an earlier mentioned noun. Deictically, or when pointing something out in real life and bringing it to the conversation, speakers always use other words. But what's pya here? What even is that word? The gloss says VSPROX, but that's not very helpful. See, Tyryani has a very complex system of deixis and anaphora. Instead of an easy two-way distinction between proximal and distal demonstratives, this versus that, or even a three-way distinction including a medial set, this versus that by you versus that over there, Tyryani has 7 sets of demonstratives, depending on distance, visibility, and relevance to the conversation. Proximal is something close to the speaker, medial is something close to the listener, and distal is something far away. Visible is something you can see all of, partly visible some of, and invisible obviously you just can't see at all. Proximate is something you're just bringing up and haven't talked about before, and obviative is something that's already been in the conversation and is kind of background info by now. And not to end abruptly, but that's long enough for this showcase. Thanks again for watching, and komeretsa. Go with light. So you may have noticed I didn't talk about the writing system at all in this video, besides showing a few examples. That's because it would have been way too long if I had. I might make another video about the writing system though soon. We'll see. And so next are some in-process screenshots of me doing Tyryani calligraphy on Procreate for the title slide of this video.